In the middle of a live television broadcast, a 150-pound predator stopped dead in its tracks, looked into the eyes of a trembling veteran, and let out a soft, weeping sound that no one, not even the experts, thought was possible. The massive wolf ignored the bright lights and the loud crowd, focused entirely on the woman in the military uniform, as if the rest of the world had simply disappeared. Everyone watching held their breath because they were witnessing a miracle of memory and love that bypassed every rule of nature. Let me take you back to where it all started. 3 years ago, Natalie Vance was miles away from any city, stationed in a valley so cold that the breath turned to ice on her scarf the second she stepped outside. She was an army medic, and her job was to be the strongest person in the room, but inside, she was falling apart. She had just received the news that her father had passed away. Because she was deployed, she couldn't go home to hold her mother's hand or stand by his grave. She felt like a ghost walking around the base. One evening, she walked out to the very edge of the safety wire, just wanting to hear something other than the hum of the heaters. That was when she heard the cry. It was a tiny, high-pitched whimper that sounded like a lost child. Natalie followed the sound to a deep, jagged crack in the frozen earth. She climbed down, her boots sliding on the loose rocks, and that is where she saw him. He was a tiny wolf cub, his fur the color of charcoal and his ribs poking out like a row of small sticks. He was curled up against a dead branch, shivering so hard his whole body was vibrating. Natalie knew the rules. She knew she was supposed to walk away and let nature take its course. But she looked at that cub, alone in the dark and the cold, and she saw herself. She saw a living thing that didn't have anyone left to protect it. Natalie unzipped her heavy military parka and reached down. The cub tried to let out a small hiss, but he was too weak to even show his teeth. She scooped him up and tucked him right against her chest, feeling his icy fur against her skin. She walked back to her barracks with her arms folded over her chest to hide the bump in her jacket. When she got to her room, she locked the door and pulled him out. He was barely breathing. Natalie didn't have milk or a bottle, so she sat on the floor and looked through her medic bag. She found a plastic syringe and mixed some warm water with a little bit of sugar and a crushed-up protein bar. She held the cub in her lap and squeezed a single drop into his mouth. He didn't move at first, and Natalie felt a lump in her throat. "Please," she whispered. "Don't go yet. I just found you." After a few seconds, the cub's pink tongue flicked out and licked the drop away. Natalie felt a rush of hope that she hadn't felt in months. She spent the next 6 hours sitting on the floor, feeding him drop by drop until his little belly felt warm. She made him a bed out of an old fleece jacket inside a plastic crate under her cot. That night, she didn't sleep. Every time the wind banged against the metal roof of the barracks, she reached down to make sure he was still breathing. The next morning, the real trouble started. Natalie had to go to work at the clinic, but she couldn't leave a crying wolf cub alone in her room. She tried to muffle the crate with blankets, but Khan, the name she gave him because it meant leader, was starting to get his voice back. Just as she was about to head out, there was a knock on the door. It was Miller, a guy from her unit who always had a way of knowing when something was wrong. "Vance, you okay? You missed breakfast," Miller said through the door. Before she could answer, a loud, sharp yip came from under the bed. The room went silent. Natalie opened the door just a crack, her face pale. "I'm busy, Miller," she said. But Miller wasn't easily fooled. He pushed the door open and looked at the floor. He saw the crate. He saw the charcoal-colored head poking out. His eyes went wide. "Natalie, are you crazy? That's a wolf. If the captain finds out, they'll send you home with a black mark on your record so fast your head will spin." Natalie stood her ground, her jaw set. "He was dying, Miller. His mom is gone. I couldn't leave him." Miller looked at the cub, then back at Natalie's tired, red eyes. He knew about her father. He knew she was holding onto this cub because it was the only thing keeping her from sinking into the dark. He sighed and closed the door behind him. "If we're going to do this," Miller whispered, "we need a better plan than a plastic crate, and we need real food." From that day on, Natalie wasn't alone in her secret. Miller started sneaking extra eggs and meat from the mess hall, hiding them in his pockets. They became a little family in the middle of a war zone. Khan grew fast. Within 2 weeks, his blue eyes turned to a bright, piercing gold. He started to recognize the sound of Natalie's boots. Even when she was still 50 yards away from the barracks, he would start pacing in his crate, his tail thumping against the plastic. When she walked in, he would go crazy with joy, licking her face and nibbling on her fingers. For Natalie, those moments were the only time she felt like a real person again. She would sit on the floor and let him crawl into her lap, telling him all the things she wanted to tell her dad. But as Khan got bigger, he got louder. He wanted to howl. He wanted to run. Natalie knew the walls were closing in. One afternoon, a high-ranking officer decided to do a random inspection of the barracks. Natalie was at the clinic when she heard the news over the radio. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She ran as fast as she could toward her room, her lungs burning in the cold air. She could see the officers moving toward her building. She knew if they opened her door, Khan would be taken, and he wouldn't survive a cage or the cold without her. She burst through the door just seconds before the officers arrived. Miller was already there, trying to hide the smell of the wolf with a bottle of cheap floor cleaner. "They're 3 doors down, Natalie. What do we do?" Miller hissed, his hands shaking. Natalie looked at Khan, who was wagging his tail, thinking it was a game. She didn't have a choice. She grabbed her large laundry bag, stuffed her dirtiest clothes inside, and gently pushed Khan to the bottom. "Stay quiet, baby. Please stay quiet," she begged him. The door swung open. 2 officers walked in, looking around with clipboards. The room smelled like lemons and old socks. Natalie stood at attention, her heart beating so loud she thought they could hear it. One officer walked over to the laundry bag. He poked it with his boot. Khan shifted inside, and the bag moved just a tiny bit. The officer frowned and leaned down. "What's in the bag, Vance?" he asked, his voice stern. Natalie didn't blink. "Just 2 weeks of dirty uniforms, sir. I was just about to head to the wash." The officer stared at her for a long, agonizing moment. He reached for the drawstring of the bag. Just then, a loud explosion echoed from the far side of the base, a controlled blast from the engineers. It startled everyone. The officer jumped, forgot about the bag, and turned toward the door. "Make sure this room stays clean, Vance," he barked, and they walked out. Natalie and Miller slumped against the wall, sliding down to the floor as the air left their lungs. Natalie pulled Khan out of the bag. The cub looked at her and licked a tear off her cheek. It was a close call, but it was a warning. She couldn't keep him here much longer. He was a wild king, and she was a soldier in a place that didn't allow for love. The close call with the officers changed everything for Natalie. She realized that she wasn't just hiding a pet. She was protecting a soul. The barracks felt smaller every day. Khan was no longer a tiny ball of fur. He was growing into his lanky legs, and his charcoal fur was turning into a beautiful, thick coat of silver and black. He didn't just crawl anymore, he pounced. He had a playful spirit that Natalie needed more than she wanted to admit. Because the base was so dangerous, Natalie and Miller had to get creative. They worked out a schedule. While Natalie was on duty patching up soldiers, Miller would sit in the room with a radio turned up loud. The music helped drown out the little growls and the sound of Khan's paws hitting the floor. But the stress was starting to show on Natalie's face. She was exhausted. She was waking up every 2 hours to make sure Khan hadn't chewed through her boots or made a noise that would bring the MPs to her door. One night, a heavy snowstorm hit the base. The wind was so strong it sounded like a freight train screaming past the windows. The power went out and the heaters died. The room became an icebox within minutes. Natalie pulled all her blankets onto the floor and sat in the corner. She whistled low and Khan came running. He tucked his head under her chin, and she wrapped her heavy army coat around both of them. "I'm sorry it's so cold, Khan," she whispered. Her breath was a thick white cloud in the dark. Khan didn't mind. He licked the tip of her frozen nose and let out a deep breath. In that dark, freezing room, Natalie felt a strange sense of peace. She missed her father so much it felt like a physical ache in her chest. But holding Khan made the world feel less empty. She realized then that she wasn't just saving him because she was a medic. She was saving him because he was the only thing that made her feel human in a place made of concrete and guns. But the real trouble came a few days later. Khan got sick. He stopped eating the scraps Miller brought, and his golden eyes looked dull. He lay in his crate, shivering, but not from the cold. Natalie panicked. She couldn't take him to a vet. She was the only doctor he had. She stayed up all night, using her own medical supplies to check his heart and keep him hydrated. "Come on, buddy," she pleaded, her voice cracking. "You can't give up now. Not after everything." She took a small risk and sneaked into the medical supply tent to get some pediatric electrolytes. She had to hide behind a stack of crates when her supervisor walked by. Her heart was hammering against her ribs so hard it hurt. She felt like a criminal, but she didn't care. She got what she needed and ran back to the room. She spent the next 12 hours sitting on the floor, holding Khan's head in her lap and giving him fluids one drop at a time. By the time the sun started to peek over the mountains, Khan finally lifted his head. He let out a small, shaky yip and licked her hand. Natalie slumped against her bed and cried. She wasn't just crying because he was okay. She was crying because she knew the clock was ticking. Khan was a wolf. He was meant to run across the snow and howl at the moon, not hide under a cot in a laundry bag. The final straw happened during a training exercise. The whole unit was called out to the field, and Natalie had no choice but to leave Khan alone for 8 hours. When she came back, the room was a mess. Khan had chewed through her duffel bag and, more importantly, he had started to howl. A soldier in the next room had heard it. When Natalie walked in, Miller was standing there with a look of pure terror. "Vance, we have a problem," Miller said, pointing to the wall. "The guy next door asked me why I had a dog in here. I told him it was a recording on my phone, but he didn't believe me. He's going to tell the sergeant." Natalie looked at Khan, who was sitting there looking proud of himself. She knew the secret was out. The walls were finally falling down. She had to make a choice. Wait for them to come and kill the wild animal in the barracks, or find a way to get him to safety before the sun came up. She sat down on her cot and pulled Khan to her. She looked at his big, beautiful paws and his wild, golden eyes. "I have to let you go, don't I?" she whispered. Khan just tilted his head, his ears twitching. He didn't know about rules or soldiers. He only knew the woman who kept him warm. Natalie looked at Miller. "We need a truck, and we need to go now." The air in the small room felt thick with a secret that was finally too big to keep. Natalie sat on the edge of her cot, her head in her hands. Every time she heard a boot click against the floor in the hallway, she jumped. She knew the soldier next door was a talker, and in a place like this, news traveled faster than a radio signal. Khan was sitting at her feet, his heavy tail thumping softly against the floor. He didn't know he was a problem. To him, this tiny room was the whole world, and Natalie was the center of it. Miller leaned against the door, his arms crossed tight. "Natalie, if we get caught stealing a transport truck to move a wolf, we aren't just looking at a slap on the wrist. We're looking at a jail cell," he said. His voice was steady, but she could see his eyes darting to the window. He was a father of 2, a man with a lot to lose, but he was still standing there. He was still choosing to help her. "I can't let them take him, Miller," Natalie said, looking up. Her eyes were red from the wind and the lack of sleep. "They'll see a predator. They won't see the baby I pulled out of the ice. They'll just put him down because it's easier than finding a solution." She reached down and scratched Khan behind his ears, and the big wolf leaned his weight against her leg. It was a silent thank you that she felt in her soul. Miller looked at the wolf and then at Natalie. He saw the way she was holding on to Khan like he was a piece of her own heart. He knew Natalie had lost her dad, and he knew this wolf was the only thing that had stopped her from breaking. "Okay," Miller whispered, his voice softening. "I've got the keys to the utility truck. The guards at the north gate are in my unit. They're tired and it's snowing. If we cover the back with a tarp, they won't look twice. But we have to go now before the morning shift change." Natalie didn't waste a second. She grabbed her old laundry bag, the same one she had used to hide him during the inspection. But Khan wasn't a cub anymore. He was heavy and he was confused. As she tried to coax him into the bag, He let out a low, questioning whine. Shoo! Natalie breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. Just for a little longer, Khan. I promise I've got you. They crept out of the barracks and into the biting cold. The snow was falling in thick, heavy sheets, which was a blessing because it blurred everything. They reached the truck, and Miller hopped into the driver's seat while Natalie climbed into the back with Khan. She pulled a heavy, greasy tarp over them, and the smell of diesel and old rubber filled her nose. She pulled Khan close to her chest, whispering to him in the dark. The truck started with a loud roar that felt like a siren in the quiet night. Natalie held her breath as they approached the gate. She heard the muffled voices of the guards talking to Miller. She felt the truck stop. Khan shifted under the tarp, his claws scratching against the metal floor. Natalie pressed her hand firmly against his side, praying he wouldn't howl. Those few seconds felt like hours. Finally, the truck jerked forward and the tires crunched over the gravel as they left the perimeter behind. They drove for 2 hours into the deep, wild part of the mountains where the sanctuary was located. The sanctuary was just a small group of people who lived in a stone house, dedicated to saving the animals caught in the crossfire of the world. When they finally pulled up, the sun was just starting to turn the sky a pale, cold purple. Natalie climbed out of the truck, her legs shaking from the cold and the adrenaline. The head of the sanctuary was a woman named Anya, who had seen too much war and too much pain. She walked out to meet them, her eyes taking in the soldier and the wolf. She didn't ask for papers or money. She just looked at Khan and then at Natalie's face. You saved him, Anya said simply. I tried, Natalie replied, her voice breaking. The moment had come. Natalie had to lead Khan to the enclosure. It was a large area with trees and a stream, a place where he could finally be a wolf. But Khan didn't want the trees. He wanted Natalie. As she walked him toward the gate, he kept stopping and looking back at the truck, his golden eyes filled with a strange kind of worry. When they got inside the gate, Natalie knelt in the snow. She took off his makeshift collar, a piece of webbing from her gear. You have to stay here, Khan, she said, her tears finally falling and freezing on her cheeks. You're a king. You don't belong in a laundry bag. You belong to the wind. She hugged him one last time, burying her face in his thick, silver fur. She could smell the mountain air on him, and she knew this was the right thing, even if it felt like her heart was being ripped out of her chest. She stood up and backed away. Khan started to follow her, but Anya gently stepped in front of him with a piece of fresh meat. Natalie didn't look back. She ran to the truck and climbed in, telling Miller to go. As they drove away, she looked into the side mirror. She saw Khan standing by the fence, his head tilted, watching the only mother he had ever known disappear into the snow. That was the last time she saw him. Natalie went back to her base, finished her tour, and flew back to a quiet life in America. She got a job, she bought a house, and she tried to move on. But every time she heard the wind howl or felt a cold breeze on her neck, she thought of the charcoal cub in the ice. She told herself he was happy. She told herself he was wild. She told herself that a wolf could never remember a human for 3 long years. She was wrong. Natalie's flight back to the United States felt like a dream she couldn't wake up from. She sat by the small plane window, watching the jagged white mountains of the Hindu Kush turn into tiny ripples of sand and then disappear under a blanket of clouds. Everyone around her was cheering, talking about the burgers they were going to eat or the families they were finally going to hug. But Natalie just sat there with her hands folded in her lap, feeling the empty space where a warm, heavy weight used to be. She kept thinking about the look on Khan's face as the truck pulled away. The way he didn't run, he just stood there watching her go. She felt like she had left a part of her own body back in that snow. When she finally landed in Virginia, the world felt too loud and too colorful. The grass was too green, and the air was too thick with the smell of gasoline and cut lawns. Let me take you back to those weeks in the barracks where the secret first took root. Life in the camp had become a dangerous game of shadows. Natalie had moved Khan from the laundry bag to a more permanent hiding spot, a small gap behind the heavy metal lockers in her room. She had lined the floor with her extra wool blankets, making a nest that smelled like her and felt like home to the cub. Every morning, before the sun was even up, She would sit on the cold floor with a plastic syringe and a cup of warm water mixed with crushed-up vitamins. Khan would wait for her, his tail making a soft, thumping sound against the metal. He was still weak, his bones still poking out, but his eyes were starting to shine with a wild, golden light. Natalie would hold his small head in her palm, carefully dripping the fluid into the side of his mouth. "One more drop, Khan," she would whisper. "You have to be strong. You have to stay with me." One afternoon, Natalie was busy counting bandages in the supply tent when Miller walked in. He didn't look like his usual joking self. He looked around to make sure the captain wasn't nearby and leaned over the counter. "Natalie, we need to talk about the situation in your room," he said, his voice barely a murmur. Natalie felt her heart skip a beat. She tried to look busy, but her hands were shaking. "I don't know what you're talking about, Miller," she replied, her voice tight. Miller sighed and rubbed the back of his neck. "I went by to bring you those extra socks you asked for." The door was unlocked. "I heard it, Natalie. I heard the growling. I saw the charcoal tail." Natalie looked up, her eyes filling with tears she had been holding back for days. "Miller, please. His mother is dead. He's all alone." Miller didn't answer right away. He looked out the tent flap at the harsh, gray mountains that surrounded them. He knew Natalie's father had passed just weeks ago. He saw the way she had been walking around like a ghost until that cub showed up. "He's a wolf, Natalie," Miller finally said, his voice softening. "He's not a dog. If he gets caught, they won't just move him. They'll put him down because they think he's a threat to the unit." Natalie stepped closer, her voice a desperate plea. "He's not a threat. He's a baby. I'm a medic, Miller. My whole life is about stopping things from dying. I can't let this happen." Miller looked into her eyes and saw the raw pain there. He wasn't just looking at a soldier. He was looking at a daughter who was trying to save the only thing she had left to love. "Fine," Miller whispered, "but we have to be smart. I can get extra meat from the mess hall, but you have to keep him quiet. If he howls, we're both finished." From that moment on, the secret wasn't just Natalie's burden. It was their shared mission. Miller became the uncle of the barracks. He would sneak into the kitchen after the dinner rush and slide pieces of raw steak into his pockets. He'd bring them to Natalie's room, and together they would watch Khan eat, his little growls getting louder as he regained his strength. The tension in the base was always high, but inside that tiny room, it felt like a different world. Natalie found herself smiling for the first time in months. She would sit on the floor and let Khan bite her fingers, his fur getting thicker and softer every day. She told him stories about her father, about the farm back in Virginia, and the way the trees turned red in the fall. It was like the grief for her dad was being poured into the wolf, and in return, the wolf was giving her a reason to keep breathing. But as Khan grew, the secret got harder to keep. He wasn't a tiny ball of fluff anymore. He was getting lanky, his legs getting longer and his paws getting broader. He wanted to move. He wanted to explore. One evening, Natalie was heading back to her barracks when she saw a group of soldiers gathered near her door. Her heart dropped into her stomach. She ran forward, pushing through the crowd. "What's going on?" she barked, using her best medic voice. A young private turned to her, looking confused. "We thought we heard something crying in there, Sergeant. Sounded like a hurt animal." Natalie pushed past them and opened the door just a crack. She saw Khan peeking out from behind the locker, his ears pinned back. "It's just the pipes?" Natalie lied, her voice steady despite the fierce screaming in her head. "They're old and they moan when the wind hits the vents. Go get some sleep." The soldiers drifted away, but Natalie knew the clock was ticking. She shut the door and slumped against it, her chest heaving. Khan walked over and nudged her hand with his cold nose. He didn't know he was a danger to her career. He just knew she was his pack. Natalie sat on the floor and pulled him into her lap, burying her face in his neck. "We're running out of time, buddy," she whispered. The emotional weight of the secret was starting to crush her. She loved him more than she had ever loved anything, but that love was becoming a trap. Every day she stayed in that valley, the risk of losing him forever grew larger. She looked at Miller, who had slipped into the room behind her. "We can't keep him here, can we?" she asked. Miller shook his head slowly. "He's getting too big, Natalie. Someone is going to see him. We have to find a way to get him out of here before the sergeant does a floor-to-ceiling inspection next week." Natalie looked at Khan, who was busy chewing on one of her old bootlaces. She felt a sharp, stabbing pain in her heart. She had saved his life, but now she had to figure out how to give him a future that didn't involve a cage or a laundry bag. She realized that the hardest part of being a medic wasn't the blood or the wounds. It was the moment you realized you couldn't keep the person you saved forever. The silence in the room was heavy, filled with the sound of the wolf's breathing and the distant whistle of the wind. They were safe for tonight, but Natalie knew that the peace they had found in the middle of a war was about to end. She held Khan tighter, wishing she could stop the world from turning, just for a little while longer. One night, the walls felt like they were closing in, and Natalie knew Khan needed to feel the cold air on his fur or he would lose his mind. She looked at Miller, who was checking the hallway through the door crack. "We have to take him out," she whispered. Miller looked at her like she was crazy, but he saw the way the wolf was pacing the small room, his claws clicking softly on the floor. "The moon is hidden by clouds tonight," Miller said, grabbing his heavy jacket. "If we stay behind the fuel tanks, the guards won't see us from the towers." Natalie wrapped a piece of soft rope around Khan's neck, her heart thumping in her throat. They stepped out into the biting dark, the wind hitting their faces like a slap. Khan froze for a second, his nose twitching as he smelled the vast, open mountains. He didn't run. Instead, he stayed glued to Natalie's leg, his shoulder brushing against her knee. They walked in the shadows of the massive metal tanks, the smell of oil and frozen dirt filling the air. For a few minutes, it felt like they were the only three living things on the planet. Natalie watched Khan sniff a patch of snow, his tail wagging in a slow, happy circle. It was a small victory, a moment of being a normal wolf, but it was cut short by the sound of a heavy engine. A patrol jeep was coming around the corner. "Down!" Miller hissed, pulling Natalie behind a stack of wooden crates. Natalie grabbed Khan and pulled him into her lap, wrapping her arms around his neck to keep him still. The headlights of the jeep swept over the crates, the yellow beams cutting through the falling snow. Natalie squeezed her eyes shut, praying the wolf wouldn't bark or whine. Khan seemed to understand the danger. He went completely still, his body turning into a statue against her chest. The jeep passed by, the red taillights fading into the dark. Natalie let out a breath she felt like she'd been holding for a lifetime. "That's it," Miller whispered, his face pale in the moonlight. "We can't do this again, Natalie. We got lucky, but luck runs out in this place." They hurried back to the room, the tension so thick it made Natalie's head ache. As she locked the door, she realized that keeping Khan wasn't just a secret anymore. It was a war of its own. She spent the rest of the night sitting on the floor, watching the wolf sleep. She looked at her medical kit, the syringes and the bandages, and thought about how she was trained to fix things that were broken. But she couldn't fix the fact that the world wanted to keep them apart. As the days turned into the third week, the emotional strain began to change Natalie. The grief for her father didn't go away, but it transformed into a fierce, protective love for the wolf. He was the only thing she had left that didn't ask her to be a soldier. He just asked her to be Natalie. She found herself talking to him more than she talked to the other soldiers. "You're going to see the big woods one day, Khan," she'd tell him while he chewed on a piece of dried meat. "There's a place where the snow is deep and no one has boots on. You'll be the king there." Khan would just look at her with those golden eyes, leaning his head against her hand as if he knew she was making him a promise. But the real world was waiting outside the door. Miller came in one morning with a look that told Natalie the game was finally over. "The sergeant is doing a surprise health and welfare inspection in 2 hours," Miller said, his voice shaking. "They're checking every locker, every bed, and every bag. There's nowhere left to hide him, Natalie." Natalie felt a cold wave of panic wash over her. She looked at Khan, who was jumping around, thinking Miller was there to play. She knew she couldn't hide a half-grown wolf in a locker. This was the moment she had been dreading, the moment when her secret would either be his end or his beginning. "Get the truck ready," Natalie said, her voice suddenly turning as steady as it was when she was stitching a wound. "We aren't waiting for them to find him. We're leaving now." Miller didn't argue. He knew that look in her eyes. He knew that Natalie would rather lose her rank than lose the creature that had taught her how to feel again. They began to pack a small bag, the silence in the room heavy with the realization that they were about to risk everything for a wild heart that didn't even know it was in danger. The tension in the barracks had reached a breaking point. Every time a door slammed down the hall, Natalie felt a jolt of electricity run through her spine. She looked at the small pile of gear she had gathered, her medic bag, a canteen, and a heavy wool blanket. Khan stood by the locker, sensing the frantic energy in the room. He didn't wag his tail this time. He stood low to the ground, his ears swiveling toward the hallway. "I'll pull the utility truck around to the side of the loading dock," Miller whispered, his hand on the door handle. "You have exactly 3 minutes to get him from here to the back of the flatbed. If the sergeant catches us, I'm telling him I was just moving supplies and I didn't know you were back there. You hear me?" Natalie nodded, but she knew Miller was lying. If they went down together. "I hear you, Miller. Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," he muttered before disappearing into the gray morning light. Natalie turned to Khan. She didn't have a leash, so she took her extra uniform belt and looped it through his makeshift collar. "This is it, Khan. You have to be the quietest wolf in the world." She stuffed him into the large green laundry bag. It was a tight fit now. Khan was heavy, his solid muscle making the bag bulge in odd shapes. He let out a tiny, muffled whine, and Natalie felt a sob catch in her throat. She heaved the bag over her shoulder, the weight straining her back, and stepped out into the hall. The walk to the loading dock felt like it took 100 years. She passed the communal showers, the smell of bleach and steam making her dizzy. Just as she reached the exit, a voice boomed from behind her. "Vance, where do you think you're going with that load?" It was the barracks sergeant, a man with a face like a bulldog and a temper to match. Natalie stopped, her boots frozen to the linoleum. She felt the laundry bag move. Khan was shifting, his claws snagging on her shirt through the canvas. "Taking it to the wash, Sergeant," Natalie said, her voice steady but her heart hammering so hard she thought her ribs might snap. The sergeant walked closer, squinting. "That's a hell of a lot of laundry for one medic. You sure you aren't stealing extra blankets?" He reached out a hand toward the bag. In that second, Natalie's life flashed before her eyes. She saw her father's smile, the frozen ravine, and the golden eyes of the creature she was trying to save. She took a half step back. "Just trying to get ahead of the inspection, sir. You know how the machines get crowded." The sergeant stared at her for a long, cold moment. Then, someone yelled his name from the other end of the hall. He grunted, waved her off, and turned away. Natalie didn't wait. She burst through the heavy doors and into the freezing air. Miller was waiting, the truck engine idling with a low growl. Natalie scrambled into the back, pulling a heavy, oil-stained tarp over herself and the bag. The truck lurched forward, and she finally let Khan out of the bag. He was panting, his tongue lolling out, but he was safe. As they drove away from the only home he had ever known, Natalie looked through a gap in the tarp. She saw the fences and the towers disappearing into the snow. The struggle to keep him alive was over, but the struggle to let him go was just beginning. Natalie sat in the dark, bouncing with the movement of the truck, and realized that her heart was no longer her own. It belonged to the wild thing leaning against her knees. She had fixed his body, she had hidden his secret, and now she had to find the strength to give him the one thing she couldn't provide in a barracks room: a life without walls. The drive to the sanctuary felt like it was happening in a different world. Outside the truck, the mountains were white and jagged, looking like the teeth of a giant. Inside the back of the truck, under the heavy tarp, it was dark and smelled like old metal. Natalie sat on the floor with her back against the side of the truck, holding Khan close. He was leaning his whole weight against her, his head resting on her lap. He didn't understand that they were leaving for good. He just liked the way the truck vibrated and the way Natalie was petting his ears. "We're almost there, Natalie," Miller called out from the front. His voice was muffled by the wind and the engine. Natalie didn't answer. She couldn't. She was looking at Khan's paws. They were huge now, with thick black pads made for running over rocks and ice. She thought about her father's old hunting dogs back in Virginia and how they used to sleep by the fireplace. Khan would never have a fireplace. He would never have a warm rug. But he would have the stars and he would have the wind. That had to be enough. The truck slowed down and finally stopped. When Miller pulled the tarp back, the cold air hit Natalie like a bucket of water. They were standing in front of a small stone house surrounded by a high wire fence. This was the sanctuary. A woman named Anya walked out of the house. She had gray hair pulled back in a tight knot and eyes that looked like they had seen everything. She didn't say hello. She just looked at the wolf in the back of the truck. "He's beautiful," Anya said. Her voice was soft, but it had a lot of power in it. "He's a good boy," Natalie said, her voice cracking. She helped Khan jump down from the truck. He landed in the snow and immediately started sniffing the air. He could smell other wolves. He could smell the wild. His tail went up, and his ears poked forward. For a second, he looked like a king standing there in the morning light. Miller stayed by the truck, giving Natalie some space. He looked up at the sky, his eyes wet. He had risked everything for this wolf, too. He knew that once they walked through that gate, the secret was over. The family they had built in that tiny barracks room was going to be broken. Anya opened the gate. "It's time, Natalie." Natalie led Khan toward the opening. He followed her because he trusted her. He thought they were just going on another walk behind the fuel tanks. But when they got inside the big enclosure, Natalie stopped. She knelt down in the snow and took off the belt she had used as a leash. She buried her hands in his thick, silver and charcoal for one last time. "You have to be a wolf now, Khan," she whispered into his ear. She could smell the soap she used to wash him and the scent of the wild mountains. "No more laundry bags. No more hiding under cots. You run. You howl. You remember me. Okay?" Khan licked her face, his tongue warm and rough. He gave her a small nudge with his nose, the way he did when he wanted to play. Natalie stood up and started to back away. Her heart felt like it was being squeezed by a giant hand. She saw Anya toss a piece of fresh meat toward the back of the enclosure. Khan looked at the meat, then back at Natalie. He was confused. He took a step toward her, but Natalie shook her head. "Go on, Khan. Go," she said, her voice louder now, thick with tears. She turned around and ran out the gate. She didn't look back. She climbed into the truck and told Miller to drive. As they pulled away, she looked into the side mirror. She saw Khan standing at the fence, his paws up on the wire, watching the truck go. He wasn't eating the meat. He was just watching her. Natalie sat in the passenger seat and sobbed into her hands. Miller didn't say a word. He just reached over and put a hand on her shoulder. They drove back to the base in total silence. The secret was gone. The room was empty. And as Natalie packed her bags to finally go home to America a week later, she felt like she was leaving her heart behind in a stone house in the mountains. She told herself that wolves have short memories. She told herself that in a month, he wouldn't even remember the smell of her jacket. She spent the next 3 years trying to believe that lie. Natalie landed back in Virginia on a Tuesday that felt like a lifetime away from the mountains. The war was over for her, but the silence in her small house was louder than any explosion she had ever heard. She got a job at a local clinic helping people with sprained ankles and flu shots. Her hands were still steady, and she was still the best medic in the building, but her coworkers noticed she didn't talk much. She was a young woman in her 30s, but she carried herself like someone who had lived 100 years. Every morning, she would wake up and look out her window at the rolling green hills of Virginia, but her mind was always back in that gray, frozen ravine. She felt like a ghost in her own life. She would go to the grocery store and see people arguing over the price of bread or the weather, and she wanted to scream. They didn't know about the cold that gets into your bones. They didn't know about the charcoal-colored cub that saved a soldier's soul. Natalie had a small scar on her hand from where Khan had accidentally nipped her while playing with a bootlace. Sometimes, when the clinic was quiet, she would trace that scar with her thumb. It was the only thing she had left to prove that those weeks in the barracks weren't just a dream. She often wondered if he was still alive, or if he had found a pack of his own. She hoped he had forgotten her, because the pain of remembering was almost too much for her to bear. One rainy afternoon, Natalie was sitting in her kitchen drinking coffee when her phone rang. It was a number she didn't recognize. She almost didn't answer, but something made her pick it up. "Hello, is this Natalie Vance?" A bright, energetic voice asked. "This is Natalie," she replied, her voice sounding a bit rusty. "Hi, Natalie. My name is Sarah, and I'm a producer for the Live Veteran Special. We're doing a big show next month to honor medics who served in the mountains. We heard a little bit about your story from a guy named Miller who served with you. We'd love to have you on the show to talk about the healing power of nature and your time overseas." Natalie's heart skipped a beat when she heard Miller's name. She hadn't talked to him in a year. "I don't know," Natalie said, looking at the rain hitting the glass. "I'm not really a TV person. I just did my job." "Please, Natalie," the producer said. "Miller told us you were the heart of the unit. He said you have a story that people need to hear. It's a live show in Washington, D.C. It would mean a lot to the other veterans." Natalie sighed. She thought about Miller and the way he had risked everything to help her move that laundry bag. She thought about her father and how he always told her to stand up and be counted. "Okay," she whispered. "I'll do it." She thought the interview would be easy. She thought she would just stand on a stage, say a few words about being a medic, and then go back to her quiet life. She had no idea that for the last 3 years, Anya at the sanctuary had been sending emails to the producers. She didn't know that Khan had grown into a 150-pound king who still sat by the fence every time he heard a helicopter. She didn't know that the wolf had never stopped looking at the horizon, waiting for the woman who smelled like soap and kindness. The weeks leading up to the show were a blur. Natalie practiced what she would say, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw golden eyes. She felt like something big was coming, like the air before a lightning strike. She bought a new dress blue uniform, making sure the ribbons were straight and the medals were polished. She wanted to look like the soldier her father was proud of, even if she felt like a broken person inside. On the night of the special, Natalie stood backstage in a darkened auditorium. She could hear the muffled sound of the audience and the bright music of the TV intro. Her hands started to shake, the same way they did the day she found the cub in the ice. She took a deep breath and tried to steady herself. "You're up in 2 minutes, Natalie," a stagehand whispered. Natalie looked at her reflection in a small mirror. She saw a woman who had survived a war and a broken heart. She thought about the mountain, the secret under the cot, and the long goodbye in the snow. She stepped out into the blinding white spotlights, the heat of the lamps hitting her face. She walked to the center of the stage, the crowd clapping loudly. She felt like she was walking into a dream. The host sat across from her, smiling. "Natalie, tell us about the one thing that kept you going when things were at their darkest." Natalie looked into the camera, and for a second, she forgot she was on TV. "I found something in the snow," she started, her voice catching. "I thought I was saving him, but the truth is, he was the only thing that made me want to come home." She didn't know that just 20 feet away, behind a heavy black curtain, a massive wolf was straining against his lead. He had been on a long flight, he was confused by the smells of the city, and he was agitated. But then he heard it. Through the thick fabric of the curtain, a voice traveled across the stage. A voice he hadn't heard in 3 years, but one that was burned into his very soul. Khan stopped pacing. His ears snapped forward. He let out a low, soft whine that made the handler freeze in surprise. The king had found his queen. The host of the show leaned forward, his eyes soft as he looked at Natalie. "You call him your mountain ghost, Natalie. But most people believe wild animals don't have room for memory. They think once they return to the woods, the human world just fades away. Do you really believe he still knows who you are?" Natalie looked down at the medals on her chest, her thumb tracing the small scar on her palm. "I don't know if he remembers my face," she said quietly, "but I know he remembers how it felt to be warm when the world was freezing. That kind of thing doesn't just leave you. The host nodded toward the side of the stage. Well, let's find out. Natalie, there is someone who traveled across an ocean to be here tonight. Natalie's heart felt like it was hammering against a stone wall. The heavy black curtain at the edge of the stage began to slide open with a slow, mechanical groan. The audience went completely silent, a thick hush falling over the room. Out stepped a handler in a dark uniform, holding a thick, braided lead. Beside him walked a creature that didn't look like the tiny, charcoal-colored cub Natalie had tucked into her jacket 3 years ago. This was a king. Khan was massive, his silver and black fur thick and lustrous under the studio lights. He looked powerful, his muscles rippling under his coat with every step. He looked around the room, his golden eyes wide and defensive. He didn't like the lights. He didn't like the smell of the hundreds of strangers in the seats. He let out a low, vibrating growl that made the people in the front row lean back in fear. Natalie stood up, her legs feeling like they were made of water. She didn't care about the cameras. She didn't care about the millions of people watching at home. She only saw those golden eyes. "Khan?" she whispered. Her voice was small, barely louder than a breath, but in the silence of the studio, it carried like a bell. The wolf stopped instantly. His ears, which had been pinned back in anger, snapped forward. The growl died in his throat. He turned his head toward the center of the stage, his nose twitching as he caught the scent of the air. Natalie took one step forward, the floorboards creaking under her boots. "Khan, it's me. It's Natalie." The change in the wolf was so fast it made the host gasp. The tension left Khan's body all at once. He didn't bark and he didn't howl. Instead, he let out a high-pitched, whistling chirp, the exact same sound he used to make when he was a baby hiding in a laundry bag. It was the sound of a child finding its mother in a dark room. He lunged forward, nearly pulling the handler off his feet. He wasn't attacking. He was desperate to reach her. Natalie fell to her knees as the 150-pound wolf reached her. He didn't bite or snap. He shoved his massive, furry head into the crook of her neck, burying his face against her skin. Natalie wrapped her arms around his thick neck, her fingers disappearing into the silver fur she had once dried with a wool sock. The smell of him hit her, wild sage, cold wind, and something that felt like home. Khan began to make a deep, rumbling sound in his chest, a purr so powerful it vibrated through Natalie's own ribs. He was leaning his entire weight against her, licking the tears that were streaming down her face. "You remembered." Natalie sobbed into his fur. "You really remembered." The audience wasn't clapping anymore. They were crying. The cameras stayed on them, capturing the moment a soldier and a wolf became a family again. Natalie realized in that moment that science was wrong. Memory wasn't just in the brain, it was in the heartbeat. Khan didn't need to see her ID or her medals. He knew the rhythm of the heart that had kept him warm when he was dying. He knew the hands that had fed him drop by drop. After the show ended and the bright lights were finally turned off, Natalie sat in a quiet room backstage. Khan refused to leave her side. He lay across her feet, his heavy head resting on her knees, his golden eyes never leaving her face. The handler told Natalie that the sanctuary had worked out a deal with a high-end wildlife preserve in Virginia, only 20 miles from Natalie's house. He wouldn't be in a cage in a barracks anymore. He would be in the woods, but he would be close enough for her to visit every single day. Natalie looked at her phone and saw a text from Miller. "I saw it on the news. I'm crying like a baby over here. Give the big guy a steak for me." Natalie smiled, her first real smile in 3 years. She looked at Khan and felt the hollow space in her chest finally fill up. The war was over. The long goodbye was finished. She reached down and scratched the wolf behind his ears, and he let out a long, happy sigh. She wasn't a ghost anymore. She was Natalie, and she was finally truly home. The story of the medic and the wolf proved to everyone who watched that love is a language that never fades, no matter how much time passes or how many miles stand in the way. Some bonds are written in the stars, and some are written in the snow, but the ones written in the heart are the ones that last forever. Thank you to my amazing family for staying with me until the end of this story. Your support means the world to me. If you enjoyed this journey, I just know you'll love what comes next. I've prepared something even more exciting and surprising that I can't wait to share with you. Just click on the end card appearing on your screen right now to watch the next one.